Yeah, so welcome everyone to the end of the week. Today we're discussing chapter 14. It's a really short chapter, so hopefully we can get out of here pretty quickly. But the interesting thing is, though this is a short chapter, I felt it was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah, Shekinah. It was the chapter on bed rest and premature birth. So whatever the number is. Yeah, 6 pages, yeah. Okay, I apologize for getting the number wrong. Anyway, really short chapter, but was doing a lot of heavy lifting, I felt. So let's just dive right in. Who wants to summarize what happened in this chapter for us? I already gave you, most of it. Yeah, Lily. Cool. Anyone want to add to that? So yeah, with this concept of premature birth, and then later in the chapter with the concept of bed rest, like I said, I felt this chapter was doing a lot of heavy lifting. In part, it was normalizing what might otherwise be unviable pregnancies, right? Which is something we don't talk about very often, but is something that happens. She gave a couple stats, depending on how preterm you are, 5 out of every 100, 5 out of every 500, stuff like that. So not unheard of, certainly. Less rare than they used to be. And premature births are now more viable than they used to be, given advances in heart machines and lung machines. What did you guys think of this? Who had some impressions or takeaways from this chapter? Yeah, Peyton. All right, so definitely there were some personal biases, perhaps some statistical biases as well. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think? So on the one hand, this data was very helpful. We got a lot of, I think, high quality information. Some of the things regarding steroids or birth delay were very powerful, and by powerful I mean in the statistical sense, very powerful in the medical sense. A short amount of time can do a great deal for things like lung development of the fetus. But at the same time, a lot of the medical science that was discussed in this chapter could feel very prescriptive. So does anyone want to comment on the chapter more or push back some? I know it's Friday, I know it's 8:30 in the morning, but you guys got to participate. Yeah, Annika. Yeah, very straight to the point, very straightforward. Let's talk about bed rest. What did the research say on bed rest? Yeah, Sita.
benefited from bed rest would have the same outcome if they continued with normal activities.
Right, so the evidence on bed rest is null results, which means there is no strong indicator of a positive response, or a negative response for that matter. But there's something more about bed rest that was really sort of striking and important to discuss. Yeah, Kate. Yeah, there are consequences to bed rest outside of the pregnancy. What happens when you're on bed rest? Yeah, right. Atrophy, yeah, great job. So it can have problems for muscle mass, bone density, it can have problems, but beyond that, when you're on bed rest, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're not doing anything. No more than 2 hours of activity a day, you're sitting around, you're not doing anything. This is bad for bone density, it's bad for muscle mass, it might be bad for mother and fetal weight. Peyton had a hand. Excellent point. So we have this prescription, and doctors prescribe it all the time. Prescribe bed rest. There's no clear outcome that it's positive for the fetus. There's some indications that it's bad for the mother in terms of muscle density and bone density and weight. And then there's this other problem where if you're on bed rest, you're not working. So 1, 2, 3, 7 days of lost wages is non-trivial, especially for some mothers. I think this is really interesting and really powerful for a couple reasons. One of our pushbacks against the earlier chapters was it seemed to be directed towards a wealthy subset of mothers. But this one raises a really interesting concern for mothers who might not be as wealthy, might not have that flexibility to take a week off of work and do nothing, particularly if there's no advantage, no positive outcome for the child. Thoughts? Yeah, Sita.
Also, like with that, the psychological stress, either if it is for financial reasons or just stress of like not being able to do anything for an extended period of time, probably has like more drastically negative effects.
Yeah, excellent point. We've all been in quarantine more or less for the past year. Sitting around doing nothing weighs on you. It's isolating. Even beyond the effects on your wages, even beyond the effects on your bone density, it's not fun to sit around doing nothing. There are psychological effects. Yeah, Juliet. Right, so if something like bed rest in particular is weighing on you, it might be comorbid with some other diagnoses. Yeah, Jackie. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we have medical things at play, we have psychological things at play, we have economic things at play, and we also have policy things at play. And Jackie, you raise a really great point, in part because one of the things we did this week was take our concept of cause and effect and start graphing it out using DAGs. And our core assumption of DAGs was that everything that goes into that causal model was written up on the screen. And we might have fudged it a little bit by just saying, this one variable stands for everything else. So we had our example of, does college raise your earnings? Well, there's college, there's earnings, there's your parents, there's how much money your parents have, and then there's background factors. Background factors are everything else. And what was really striking about learning that and then putting it on this bed rest chapter is it seemed like people hadn't drawn out their DAGs fully. There's bed rest, there's child outcomes. In fact, the causal arrow between those two is non-existent. There's no clear link. But what we're seeing is people forgetting to leave in all those other outcomes. Whether or not there's a good policy in place. Whether or not the mother is comorbid for certain depressive disorders. Whether or not you have an hourly job that you can't take off. Whether or not you're susceptible to muscle mass loss. I said at the beginning, this chapter was doing a lot of heavy lifting, in part because, at least to me, it was tying together what we've been learning about cause and effect, what we've been learning about ruling out alternative explanations, and perhaps thinking of alternative outcomes. This chapter highlighted a problem with when we don't do that. What about the rest of you? What do you think? Who had some strong impressions from this chapter? Excellent point that it highlights a lack of policy or a policy need. What else? What did you guys take away from this chapter? Elizabeth.
I'm just like continuing to be like really shocked. And I know this is like the whole point of the book, that like our standard medical practice can lack so much like really data behind why we do this. Like why isn't this book like assigned to like first year obstetrician doctors everywhere? Because I just think it's crazy and it continues to shock me every week.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not necessarily trying to shill for Emily Oster here, but this book is shocking because it teases apart a lot of what we know about medical science versus conventional wisdom. But then when you get to the next book in the series, where it's young children, there are 3 books now. There's Expecting Better, which is the pregnancy. There's Crib Sheet, which is toddlers. And then coming out in May is the 3rd book, Family Firm. Anyway, the point that I was making is when you get to the next book on Crib Sheet, there's a lot less in terms of the medical science, because so much of our medical concerns are, will this keep the child alive? Or will this harm the child's brain development or lung development? But once the baby is out and we're dealing with questions of breastfeeding versus formula, or co-sleeping versus crib sleeping, or any number of open-ended questions, there's hardly any medical science there because those outcomes aren't as clear-cut. It's not, does this keep the baby alive? Does this bring it to a viable full-term birth? And it's just people fighting on Facebook. I'm not exaggerating. She calls it in the next book, which is not required reading, but you raise a really interesting point, and it's worth talking about. She calls it in the next book, the mommy wars. It's just people yelling at you on Facebook. So if you are struck by this now, just wait. But yeah, excellent point. Why do we have so much reliance on conventional wisdom in this space? Why isn't it standard medical practice? And as she mentions a couple chapters ago, standard medical practice is sort of a misnomer too, because you might have the American Pediatric Society recommending one thing, and the European Pediatric Society recommending another thing, and the American Association of Obstetricians recommending a third thing. And what a standard practice is, what an official recommendation is, varies from group to group, from doctor to doctor, from birth to birth, and it's really hard to evaluate some of this information. And remember, we're using pregnancy as a lens through which we can view data-driven decisions. But this applies to all decisions in our lives. The decisions you guys are writing about at the end of the term, right? Semester, not term, like pregnancy term. Whether or not you want to move to California. Whether or not you want to buy a horse farm. Some of you are writing about policy-based decisions. Should we institute fully paid family leave? What does that look like? What can we put into that DAG? How can we get more information there? Because that's going to be an area where we might not be able to run an RCT and get that clean experimental design. So what are some ways we can rule out alternative explanations? Elizabeth, excellent point. You in the green shirt, I'm sorry, I don't know your name yet. You had a hand up. Renee? Yeah, excellent point. And for anyone who didn't hear Renee, what it sounded like you were saying, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing, but we do a lot of sitting around in our day-to-day lives. We binge Netflix shows, but once there's this diagnosis, or I should say prescription attached to it, bed rest, becomes a whole different thing. And I think where that disconnect lies is sort of twofold. One, in the case of bed rest, we're not just talking about the health of the mother, but also whether or not it indicates anything for the health of the fetus. But two, bed rest is very prescriptive. Obviously, it's a prescription, but it's prescriptive in the sense it's no more than 1 or 2 hours of activity. So, yeah, I might go home and spend the weekend watching Netflix, but I'm also going to be up, I'm going to be doing the dishes, I'm going to go out, to run errands. Bed rest prohibits all that. Excellent point. What about the rest of you? Yeah. Right, and remind me of your name, I'm sorry. Right. Excellent point. And it raises something we've been talking about, with our discussion of treatment effects, right? We can't observe a true counterfactual. We can't observe someone with and without treatment. So you might have had bed rest and felt great afterwards. You might have had bed rest and felt weakened afterwards. You might have had bed rest and felt financially weakened afterwards. But we can't observe you in the states with and without bed rest. What we have to do is observe a bunch of people and get that average treatment effect rather than an individual treatment effect, which is by definition unobservable. But when we're talking to other mothers, we're talking to people who have their own experience, but by definition can't observe their own counterfactual. When we're talking to doctors, like you mentioned, rightfully so, oftentimes it's the exact opposite. Doctors have seen lots of patients, but many doctors have no experience of pregnancy from the other end of the table. Yeah, Cynthia. Excellent point. It sounds like it's relating a lot to what Juliet was saying earlier. Yeah, Sita.
Kind of going back to the conventional wisdom and mommy wars and that idea is that it's interesting because there is data there from all these people's experiences, but I think that there's nothing that allows us to look at it as a whole and then draw conclusions from it. So it's just you either have to believe one person or not another person, which is Emily Oster talks a lot about how she's doing all this data so that everyone can draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, excellent point. So remember, when we say data, all we mean is information. And it's not like there's not information out there. But how can we understand that information in a systematic way? And I think that's what we're trying to do with this class, but also with this book. Let's jump from bed rest back to the premature birth. Because that, especially given Juliet and Cynthia's points about, about depression in pregnancy, I think is really striking. One of the things that jumped out at me in this chapter was even when she had more data, knowing that as she's becoming closer to full term, these premature births are less and less problematic, didn't ease her mental state at all. She was still freaked out, rightfully so. So what do you guys think about that? Yeah, Lily.
I think that it had a lot to do with her talking about how most real issues come up in the third trimester, so just switching from the fear of giving birth to other complications. But then I think a theme in that chapter was that she said she couldn't really make, there were no decisions to be made because there were so many variables in this kind of complications between the mother and the doctor and pre-existing conditions and just so many different things that it would have to be case by case basis. And so there was no way to have a plan for anything really except for just kind of looking at the wisdom and data already there about what usually happens.
Yeah, excellent point. And I think it ties into some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, right? So when there's nothing you can do except sit and think about bad outcomes, it's going to weigh on you, particularly if you're prone to depressive episodes, or if you're already stressed about finances, or all these other things that might indicate that bed rest is probably not the best thing for you. The fact that there's not a lot else you can do is going to compound that fact. Juliet, is that a hand?
Also, when it comes to premature births, there are instances where, it could be fine, it could just be a day early, but that could also just lead to more risk down the line. You can't predict that either. Just the fact that if being born prematurely didn't lead to complications by that act alone, it might be less, but there's a lot more down the line.
Excellent point. And to build on what you were saying, we have these horror stories of premature births, but we've also seen rapid advancements in heart and lung machines and NICUs, neonatal ICUs. So the premature births that our parents were worried about are not the same sorts of premature births that we're worried about necessarily. Elizabeth, was that a hand?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think she mentioned this, but I was wondering if people, like, I know when we were being born, it still happened to some people where, like, if they were going into premature labor, they would have bed rest, but, like, with their feet elevated, so that they were, like, kind of keep the baby inside with gravity. Do you know if they still do that?
I don't, but the treatment she does reference is various things to delay labor, including steroids, which are going to speed up lung production in the fetus, and how even delaying it, if you're going into preterm labor, even delaying it a few hours is going to be very helpful for viability of the soon-to-be baby. Yeah, Juliet.
So I actually had tried with them early, and there was a medication for that particularly, at least until it was considered safe. I don't remember what the medication was called though.
But various hormones, various steroids, different things. I don't know if it's so much the gravity effect anymore.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, because I was like, oh, I thought it'd be cool if we talked about that, but I was like, maybe we don't even do that anymore. So.
Anyone else? Thoughts? All right, so like I said, this was a really short chapter, but I felt like it was doing a lot of heavy lifting. We can go home early, but before we do, I want to take a second. What are the big lessons you guys took away from this chapter? And remember, when we think about big lessons in a chapter, they don't have to be pregnancy and birth related. They can be about data more generally. Yeah, Sita.
I think for me it was that like even those like nonchalant suggestions like bed rest can have either zero good outcome or be actually negative. So like to think about things even if they seem very commonplace.
Right. So we can have commonplace suggestions. You raise what I think are actually two really profound and important points. So let's unpack them. One is the concept of the null effect. Right? Null effect is a word we use in stats, in math, to mean no particular effect. This is very different than a negative effect, which you also raise the important point of. A null effect means no impact. So let's make a silly example like we've been doing with banana peels. Banana peel might cause you to slip. An apple peel, apple skin, might have null effect on slipping. It doesn't make you walk any stronger. So if we think of slipping as a negative effect, walking with more dexterity might be a positive effect. No one thinks about slipping on apple skin. There is no effect there. There's also the idea that some interventions, some treatments can have negative impacts. We can think of bed rest both from its perspective of no impact, right? It really doesn't do anything for the pregnancy, to perhaps its perspective of negative impact in terms of muscle mass and bone density. You atrophy when you're sitting around doing nothing. And then there's a third really important point there, which is when we're thinking about this concept of effects, this concept of outcome variable, we need to expand our search. Because it's not just what it's doing for the pregnancy, what it's doing for the health of the mother, but also, is it incurring depression? Is it stressing your finances? There are other outcome variables we need to consider. Excellent point. What about the rest of you? Any big lessons you took away from this chapter? Yeah, Kaya. Yeah. Always question conventional wisdom. Excellent point. It's actually one of the reasons I went to grad school, not because of expecting better, it wasn't written back then, but the idea that we can use science to question conventional wisdom I thought was such a cool and profound and powerful thing. All of you probably have a doctor who recommends multivitamins. In every study of multivitamins, to Sita's earlier point, they have no impact. Not a positive impact, not a negative impact. Multivitamins don't do anything. All doctors recommend multivitamins. Question your doctor. Question conventional wisdom. What about the rest of you? Any big lessons you took away from this chapter? So one thing that struck me is, like we were saying, she was really freaked out when she couldn't feel the baby kick. But this, most of the time, means it shifted position. It's not a big deal. So yes, question conventional wisdom. Yes, understand the impacts of treatment, and treatment in the broad statistical sense. It doesn't just mean bed rest or medicine. It also means whether or not there's a banana peel in the road. Understand the impacts and that they can be positive, negative, or null, but also try and approach these questions, particularly questions that might be scary, might be weighing on you, might induce stress. Try and approach them as level-headed as possible. If you're not feeling the baby kick at 26 weeks, chances are it shifted position and it's just not big enough yet for you to feel it all the time. She mentions as soon as Penelope, that's her daughter's name, as soon as Penelope got a little bigger, she felt Penelope all the time, particularly on her bladder. If you have more data, if you have more information, if you can make more data-driven decisions, then hopefully the fact that you're not feeling Penelope kick at 26 weeks isn't as scary. Particularly because we know that it's the stress of these decisions that leads to some of these negative impacts. Questions? All right, anyone want to take us home? Any final parting thoughts? All right, well, like I said, it was a really short chapter, so thank you for coming at 8:30 in the morning on a Friday, but I think you guys are really starting to get the hang of data-driven decisions. So we'll meet back on Monday. Everyone have a great weekend.